Yes, Ms. Richards.
Dr. Perry, because the questions I'm going to ask you now have come from core participants or their legal representatives over the break, they'll leap around from topic to topic a little because of the multiple sources. Okay. So apologies for that. The first question arises out of your evidence earlier today when we were discussing the question of product warnings and leaflets. And it's this. At the time, so in the early 1980s, did you think that the PFC had a responsibility to patients to provide accurate and clear information about the risk of hepatitis B and hepatitis non-A, non-B on its labels and leaflets? Or did you think the PFC had no responsibility in that regard because it was the responsibility of others, such as treating clinicians or the licensing authority?
I think it was the former. I think the PFC did feel it had a responsibility to provide appropriate warnings, but as we discussed, I think those warnings to an extent are prescribed or proscribed by the regulations that we operated in. So yes, of course, the PFC had a responsibility to communicate to patients, although at that time the communication was not directly to patients, it was to the doctors that treated the patients. And as I think we noted, that changed in 1994 when patient information leaflets, which were much clearer, much more explicit of risks and so on, came into force.
And did the PFC ever, to your knowledge, again, I'm talking about really the first half of the 80s here,
Sure.
ever explicitly consider the position of patients on home treatment who might essentially just be taking the products home and using them there rather than having the products administered to them by their clinicians? So in the context of labels and what should be on the labels or in the leaflets.
Providing special information to patients on home therapy.
Yes, or ensuring that whatever information was provided took account of the position of patients on home therapy.
Okay. It may well have been that PFC did provide information like that, but never directly to patients. We may have provided background information for haemophilia doctors to decide whether they wanted to include it in information that they provided to patients, but I don't think it would be appropriate. I would hesitate to say illegal, but I'm not sure of the formal regulatory position of a manufacturer providing detailed information to patients, which could be of a clinical nature or identify risks. So we may well have produced information for home therapy, patients on home therapy, but that would never have been directly with patients, nor would it be appropriate to do so now, I don't think.
But you're not aware of any particular documents or discussions or meetings which canvass that issue and what might be the information requirements of home therapy patients?
No, it was quite clear that if there was a requirement for such information, PFC and the wider SMBTS would have always responded positively to requests for detailed information that could then be provided by the doctors to their patients.
In broad terms, what measures were taken to protect those working at PFC in the processing and manufacturing plants from hepatitis?
It was, I think it was a process of just continually underlining awareness of the materials that they were dealing with. And I think in some of the documents that I've seen referenced by the inquiry, there are memos that I've sent out to all staff. We had active health and safety committees, and the underlying principle of everything that we did was to assume, for the purposes of health and safety, that the plasma that we were dealing with had infectious agents in it. And people should respond accordingly. Of course, systems and manufacturing environments were made as safe as possible, but nonetheless, on occasions, there were inescapable situations where you have open systems where large pools of plasma are being held.
when the risks of, or potential risks of viral infection leading to AIDS emerged, did the PFC change the measures it took to protect the plant workers?
No, there wasn't much that we could do. The immediate measure that we took was to reinforce the importance of existing practices, to further encourage staff to make comments and suggestions about safer methods of working, and the documents that some of the documents and that were provided to staff to assist in that, I think the inquiry has access to. But there weren't any specific. There was no vaccine. There was no way of protecting staff working at PFC from the risks of infectious agents. Although, to the very best of my knowledge, and I think it's fairly accurate, there were never any instances of transmission of either hepatitis viruses or HIV to any staff working at PFC. And probably BPL. I think we would have known about it had there been such a case.
The next question then relates to the use of red cell concentrates as the strategy, or as part of the strategy towards self-sufficiency. Do you know how Professor Cash managed to get clinicians to adopt a much more widespread use of red cell concentrates rather than whole blood? Was it force of personality or particular initiatives or steps that he took, or both? I
think it was a combination of all of those things. I think if I can sort of picture the scene in the late 70s when he was director of the blood transfusion service in Edinburgh, I would imagine part of his working day would have been visiting, speaking to colleagues, harassing them, if you like, to actually perhaps review their clinical practice. He would have never prescribed and said you were only getting red cells. He would have done it by consensus.
I asked you yesterday about pool sizes. In relation to HIV, do you accept that pool size did matter when it came to HIV, in contrast to what you said was the position in relation to non-A, non-B, because of what you described effectively as the inevitability of infection?
Yes, after so many batches, yes. Yes, I think it was a much, it had much more significance and importance when HIV emerged.
And when HIV did emerge, HTLV3 AIDS did emerge, end of 82 through into 83, and we heard from Dr. Foster last week about the information he gathered at the Stockholm conference in the middle of 83. Was any consideration given to reducing pool sizes at that point in time, even as a temporary measure, to try and reduce the risk of HIV transmission?
I think, in all honesty, there wasn't. For the reasons that I've described, reducing the pool size would have reduced the batch size. It would have reduced our capacity. Output would not have met demand, and the outcome of that would be increased commercial product purchase. So I think I don't recall any discussions being held about reducing pool size.
Do you recall the context for Dr. Crawford's suggestion of the creation of individual donor pools?
No, I don't, sorry.
BSc, the testing that was undertaken before anti-HIV testing became available, was that focused on potency?
Potency and perhaps hepatitis B surface antigen testing, and but I think it started out. Its genesis was concern that the vial potency of factor VIII concentrates being used in the UK, but particularly though not exclusively from commercial organisations, were carrying potency which didn't seem to accord with the measurements that were being made by clinicians and by NIBSC itself. So they set up a system of I think it was, I don't know, I'm not sure whether it was absolutely mandatory, but manufacturers, licensed manufacturers, were required to submit samples, and NIBSC would either confirm the potency or suggest that they assign a different potency to a particular batch.
And before HIV testing became available, roughly what proportion of PFC batches were tested by NIBSC?
Before
Before HIV testing became available, what proportion of batches were tested?
For HIV testing.
And then the next question is, did it change after HIV testing became available?
Well, before HIV testing became available, there were no batches tested for HIV.
No, sorry.
But for hepatitis B surface
yes,
antigen.
so what proportion of batches, PFC batches, were submitted to NIBSC for whatever tests they wanted to carry out?
This would be prior to 1985,
yes.
Of course. I don't think I can answer that. I think when we did have arrangements for NIBSC undertaking testing on our products, it would probably have been all the batches. But there was a short period where NIBSC said we are too busy to handle your materials, so they suspended this arrangement where we submitted batch samples for testing. But that was reintroduced about a year later, I think.
In terms of the accumulation or stockpile of material at PFC, you said in your evidence you were shocked to learn that amount had been accumulated whilst operating a pro-rata distribution system. Do you know how it happened that PFC was able to accumulate such a large surplus?
I think it was increased plasma supply, which was going up quite steeply at that time, and it was the product of the research and the development that Dr. Foster had done to increase the process yield. So I think a combination of those two factors led to an increased product stock. I was surprised that it had accumulated to such an extent and nobody had noticed.
That was really going to be my next question. How was it that nobody had noticed, and could it have been noticed rather earlier than, I think, late 1983?
Yes, I think if we'd had, but that was the purpose of me introducing a different stock control system and product supply system.
Can I just ask you to look now at PRSE 00000040? This is your note of the UK HCDO meeting 17th of October 1983. Yeah, PRSE 00000040. On bottom of the page, we looked at this passage before. It's just above the heading pasteurisation in liquid state, and it records you asking whether any viral inactivation data was available. And then it gives the example vaccinia data. What is that data that you're referring to there as a possible indicator of non-infectivity?
Vaccinia is a virus that can be used in model. It can be cultured in test tubes, if you like, and used to do model virus inactivation experiments. So when I say e.g. vaccinia data, I think we use mumps virus and various other viruses to try and calibrate our processes using model viruses. And we did that on behalf of both BPL and PFC.
And if we go to your witness statement, WITN 6920001, page 37. Just looking at paragraph 106, which we looked at earlier for different purposes, where it says in the fourth line, this included the development of in-house methods for testing the efficacy of inactivation processes using model viruses. My next question was going to be, what were the model viruses that you used at PFC? So I think you've just referred to a couple.
Yes, I think we used vaccinia, mumps. We also used, on some occasions, we used phage which are bacterial viruses that are very easily grown and utilised and can be useful as models. But there were others, but I can't remember exactly what they were. But they were viruses that selected, especially when we were looking at heat treatment, for their thermal stability. So we tried to access viruses, for instance, that we knew were resistant to heat treatment. And use those as part of a process. And then there will be other viruses that selected for different processes, like immunoglobulin preparation, where you wanted viruses that in which you could demonstrate the ability of low pH to inactivate viruses. So you use different viruses for different circumstances.
In the same document, please, Sally, can we go to page 133, different issue? Top of the page refers to a vial of the particular implicated batch from autumn of 1984, NY3009, being found in 2008 and submitted to NIBSC for testing. How did a vial of the implicated batch come to be found in 2008? Do you know?
This postdated my retirement from SMBTS, but I think I'm familiar with the context from my involvement in writing this particular report. It was a vial of product that was sent to, at that time, a close colleague of PFC and SMBTS, a virologist, Dr. Peter Simmons. And he was doing some work on identifying HIV, and we sent him, I think we sent him some of the vials that were returned from Aberdeen associated with batch 3009. This was when in the run-up to the Penrose inquiry, we knew this topic was an important topic. The transmission of HIV by this particular batch. And so the SMBTS circulated everybody it could think of who might have access to any samples of this product. And Dr. Simmons wrote back and said, yes, I've found one actually. It hadn't been held in appropriate storage. It had been held at room temperature, but we were able to gain some useful information from it.
And then we can take that down, thank you. Last question. In relation to the rollout of heat-treated concentrates from the 10th of December 1984, and given the potential for heat-treated concentrates to cause problems such as the development of inhibitors that you mentioned before, what in vivo or in vitro trials or testing of the heat-treated NY was done before the rollout?
Well, I don't think too much. I think it was, I can't remember exactly how many patients, but they were infused with the product and carefully followed up to ensure there were no short-term or long-term adverse events. But in one sense, it was an advantage of operating out of a very tightly and formally controlled regulatory system, because we were able to introduce developments like this very quickly. I think by today's standards, you would have done a much more extensive study before implementing such a change. But I think it's a good example of the urgency with which we thought this process step was required.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those submitted by core participants.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Just one area, really. It rises out of the questions which a core participant invited you to ask. You said that as far as protection of staff were concerned, you assumed, for the purposes of health and safety, that the products you were dealing with had infectious agents in them.
Yes.
Did you tell the staff that of the risks that there might be?
Yes, we did, and as soon as hepatitis B vaccination came in, all staff of PFC were vaccinated for hepatitis B. There was little other action that was taken, but they were certainly informed of the risks of needle stick injuries or abrasions or cuts and so on. And on those occasions where staff, and they were encouraged to always report those incidents, and we had the services of a GP close by and who used to attend the centre periodically, and staff would be injected with a dose of immunoglobulin following any needle stick injury or suspected needle stick injury. I'm not sure how effective that was, but that was the extent to which one could make a material intervention for staff that might have been exposed to a virus. But I think generally staff at the centre were very carefully advised and trained to, as I say, the underlying principle of the training and the behaviour control was to really just to emphasise that they had to assume that everything was effective, because we didn't know otherwise. We couldn't identify which batches might be infective or which particular place. So you assume everything is effective and behave accordingly.
And they were heavily unionised.
Yes.
So the union would have been told of the health and safety risks and pass that on as well.
Yes.
But you didn't rely just on the union to tell them.
No, we didn't rely on the union. The union, we had all the appropriate safety committees in place and safety advisory groups and so on. But no, we always felt that it was not the business. It was the management's responsibility to do appropriate training and information provision on health and safety issues. And I think we had a very cooperative relationship with the health and safety officers of ASTMS, I think it was at the time.
And although, in one sense, they couldn't avoid exposure to some risk because, after all, the product was there, you ensured, I take it, that their working practices were safe through standard operating procedures, and that they had PPE which was appropriate.
They didn't have such things as I'm not sure what they're called, hazmat suits, or but it was PPE. They were dressed in Tyvek suits. They had appropriate face coverings and head coverings, and I think we did the best that we possibly could with the materials and products that were available.
And once you were aware, not of the certainty that blood products might transmit whatever it was that was causing AIDS, but that there was a risk that it might, and you and Dr. Foster both thought, as you've told us, that it was only a matter of time before what was in America pitched up in what you were dealing with in Scotland.
Sure.
You would have passed that on as a risk that people needed to be even more aware of and more cautious, did you?
Yes, we did. I think we saw a document that I wrote, a memorandum to all staff, which was one of my methods of communicating to staff on such things, to put out a memorandum to all staff and put it on the notice board, and that certainly immediately followed. I think it was mid-November 1984. After the report of the Edinburgh cohort.
But you'd been a year before, on the 17th of October 1983, to the meeting of the UK HCDO. Now, at that meeting, was it not a topic of conversation, at least around the
HIV?
Yes, the fact that somebody had just died who had haemophilia.
I think even at that stage, though, I think I'm right in this, but I can't be absolutely sure, that the cases of HIV in haemophilia patients in the UK at that time were primarily, or at least in the majority of patients that have been treated with commercial factor VIII concentrates from the US. So there was still a view at that stage that the UK plasma, that the epidemic had yet to transmit completely to the UK.
Although by then, as my memory serves me right, the Terry Higgins Trust, as it was first known, was established in the middle of 1982. So plainly, there was some public awareness
of HIV.
Of HIV as such.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's correct.
Yes.
And it may be, I gave the example of the memo that I wrote out in mid-November 1984. It is quite possible that other communications to staff were made or the topic discussed. I think it was probably a regular topic on the agenda of the regular health and safety meetings about safety with respect to infectivity.
Well, that's where these questions were leading. So presumably there was some discussion about it. Did you hold back on any of the risks which you saw because you might alarm or upset members of the staff?
No, we explained. People knew the environment they were working in. They knew that they had 4,000 bags of plasma from 4,000 individual donors, and so it was not difficult to explain the risks. And we would talk about hepatitis B, and I think increasingly we would talk about non-A, non-B as it became better understood. And certainly when HIV, when we knew HIV was in the blood supply, as it were, we certainly included that. So no, there was no caution in presenting those risks to staff. We were concerned that staff would become extremely anxious about this, but in the event, we found they were sensible, they were cooperative, they knew the environment that they work in, and they behaved accordingly. So I don't think we collected any data on the number of needle stick injuries or abrasions that happened post HIV to measure that, but I think with hindsight we were as vigilant as we could be in terms of health and safety, and it was always an important topic.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if any questions arise out of that at all.
No, sir. Dr. Perry, is there anything further that you would wish to add?
Well, I would just like to make a couple of final comments, if I may, just to, in general, and it's really no more than, and I've actually just drafted a few notes to make sure I say what I mean to say. And I would simply like to record my acknowledgement and recognition of the scale and the depth of impact that events explored and being explored in this quarry have had on so many patients. And these events are even more tragic, having been caused by developments in my field of work in SMBTS, which held the promise of being so transformational for the treatment of haemophilia patients, but which at the same time we now know had such tragic consequences for so many patients and their families. So my last thought is that I sincerely hope that this inquiry will provide a complete as possible understanding of the events and the rationales for the decisions made by all those who were entrusted with a duty of care for the patients they served. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Perry. We will certainly try to get it as right as the evidence permits. Can I thank you in particular for coming? It's you've been here for 2 days. You've come down from Scotland, so thank you for that. In many ways, it's been most informative. So thank you. Just if you wait there for a moment or two, we have some little business to deal with, since this is the last session before we have a bit of a break from sitting. Ms. Richards, we come back, do we, in May?
We do. So we come back on the 10th of May. We'll be publishing on the inquiry's website imminently our proposed timetable for the rest of the year. Some of it we're able to populate with names of witnesses. Other days or weeks will populate as the following weeks come on. But I just wanted to explain where we've got to so far, so that those listening know who they'll be hearing from in May, June and July. So we will start on the 10th of May, continuing on to the 11th of May with evidence from Dr. Andres Raymond, Senior Medical Officer in the Department of Health 1989 to 97. And then on the 12th of May, we will be hearing from Dr. Hilary Pickles, Principal Medical Officer in the Department of Health, in particular in the Med SEB Division 1988 to 1991. And of course, both those names were mentioned in the course of the evidence this afternoon, looking at the ACVSB. On the 13th of May, Friday of that week, we turn to the first of 3 witnesses concerned with CJD and in particular VCJD. So we will be calling Professor John Collins on the 13th of May, Director of the NHS National Prion Clinic and MRC Prion Clinic. In the following week, on the 17th of May, we'll then be calling Professor James Ironside, Professor of Clinical Neuropathology and I think head of or based at the National CJD Research and Surveillance Unit in Edinburgh. The VCJD evidence continues on the 18th of May, hearing first from Dr. Nikki Connor, a consultant epidemiologist and head of the CJD section of the Health Protection Agency. And then we will have a presentation by counsel to the inquiry on a chronology of key events relevant to VCJD. 19th of May, we then return to government evidence where we will hear from David Mellor, Minister of State for Health 88 to 89 and Chief Secretary to the Treasury 1990 to 92. And then on the 20th of May from John Patton, Lord Patton, Parliamentary Under Secretary at the Department of Health and Social Security 1983 to 1985. There will then be, it's 2 weeks when the inquiry is not sitting, and the inquiry will then resume again in the week of the 6th of June, calling on the 7th of June Professor Sir Michael Rawlins, Professor of Clinical Pharmacology, but particularly for our purposes, member of the Committee of the Safety of Medicines from 1980 through to 1998. The 8th of June, we will be calling Charles Lister, Head of Blood Policy at the Department of Health, 1998 to 2003. On the 9th of June, we will be calling Justin Fenwick QC, who was instructed by the central defendants in the HIV haemophilia litigation. And on the 10th of June, Richard Gutowski, Head of Blood Policy at the Department of Health 2003 to 2005. There'll then be a further 2-week period where the inquiry is not sitting, and then it will resume on the 27th of June, and then there'll be 5 weeks when the inquiry sits week after week. So in the week of the 27th of June, we will be hearing first from Sir John Major, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer and obviously Prime Minister. On the 28th of June, Baroness Virginia Bottomley, Minister of State at the Department of Health and Secretary of State for Health, period 89 through to 95. On the 29th and 30th of June, we will be hearing from Professor Richard Tedder, whose name obviously has come up in multiple documents in terms of his involvement in relation to matters of virology, in particular in the 1980s. And then on the 1st of June, we will be hearing from Gloria Hooper, Baroness Hooper, who was parliamentary...
1st of June?
Sorry, 1st of July, who was Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health 1989 to 1992. In the week of the 4th of July, we will be calling William Waldegrave, Lord Waldegrave, Secretary of State for Health 1990 to 92, Chief Secretary to the Treasury 95 to 97, and that will be on the 5th and 6th of July. On the 7th of July, we anticipate a Council to the Inquiry presentation on the role and the decision-making of the Chief Medical Officers of the Departments of Health in the 1970s and 1980s. On the week of the 11th of July, on the Monday and Tuesday of that week, so the 11th and 12th of July, we will be calling Sir Robert Francis to talk about and answer questions about his infected blood compensation framework study. The witnesses for the 13th and 14th of July of that week are yet to be confirmed, and as soon as we have confirmed the position, those details will be published on the inquiry's website. On the 15th of July, we will be calling Andy Burnham, Minister of State at the Department of Health 2006-7 and Secretary of State for Health 2009-10. In the week of the 18th of July, we intend calling evidence relating to government decision-making and the response of governments in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. We are yet to fully flesh out that week. We will be calling, however, in the course of that week, John Reid, Lord Reid, Secretary of State for Health 2003-5, also occupied positions as Secretary of State for Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we'll be calling Hazel Blears, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Health 2001-2003. In the week of the 25th of July, the focus will be in particular on decision-making and the response of governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Again, we'll need to confirm the details of who will be called, but one of the witnesses will be Professor Aileen Keel, Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, and prior to that, a medical officer in the Scottish Home and Health Department. That will conclude the summer evidence that week of the 25th of July. The inquiry will then resume in the week of the 12th of September, so some of these are additional weeks to those previously published on the inquiry's website. The focus of the evidence called and examined in the week of the 12th of September will relate to issues of candour, openness, cover-up and record keeping. On the 12th of September, so the Monday, we'll be calling Nigel Crisp, Lord Crisp, who was Permanent Secretary at the Department for Health 2000 to 2006, and we'll also be calling Zabida Sidat, a civil servant in the blood policy team at the Department of Health. On the 13th of September, we'll be calling William Connon, who was Head of Blood Policy at the Department of Health 2005 to 2009. There will then, in the afternoon of the 13th of September and on the 14th of September, be a number of presentations by Council to the Inquiry on matters relevant to transparency, cover-up and record keeping. On the 15th of September, we will be calling in the morning Susan Douglas, who was the political correspondent at the Mail on Sunday in 1983. Obviously many other journalistic roles during her career. And then there will be further presentations by Council to the Inquiry. 16th of September, we'll be calling Caroline Flint, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health, 2005 to 6, and Minister of State for Public Health, 2006 to 7, and there will be further presentations by Council to the Inquiry. In the week of the 19th of September, we anticipate having further evidence about government decision-making and the response of governments, a combination of witnesses and presentations, but we do not yet know exactly what that week will comprise. We then move to the week of the 26th of September, where we hope to have panels of people who were infected and affected giving evidence, and the week of the 3rd of October, where we will be hearing further expert evidence and also panels of people infected and affected. Currently, it's then envisaged that the weeks of the 7th and 14th of November will hear evidence relevant to the making of recommendations by the inquiry, and then the indicative weeks for the making of oral submissions remain as previously indicated, the weeks of the 28th of November, 5th of December and 12th of December. So that, I hope, is a useful update of the inquiry's future hearing plans for the remainder of this calendar year.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Richards. Let me add a few words of my own. I know that it can be all too easy to become so focused in some of the detail of what we have been hearing as to lose sight of how what we have already heard may fit together with what we are next to hear. But witnesses and topics are not heard at random. I hope you'll have recognized that there is some pattern to what the inquiry is doing. Everything started, everything will finish with the experiences of those infected by blood and blood products given to them by the NHS. Building on what we heard earlier, in the last 6 months, we've heard how that blood was collected, transfused, or turned into blood products, and of blood products which were administered by the NHS but came from abroad. We've heard how palliative care, properly delivered, can assist. In the next 3 months, as you've just heard, we're turning to government, which oversaw and had ultimate responsibility for what happened. I'm looking forward to hearing what civil servants and former government ministers have to say, and like many of you, to what Sir Robert Francis will have to say. It's going to be an intensive timetable as we get closer to the end of the hearings, but I want to highlight 2 things which mustn't go unnoticed. First, I know that some statements, which are in the pipeline, have not yet been submitted to the inquiry. It would be of real assistance to me if those statements could be provided by the end of September. I'm determined to read each and every one of them. And legal representatives, this is particularly for you, let the inquiry have them as and when they are ready and not just in an avalanche or all at once. Now, that's a firm request rather than an absolute deadline, but the second matter does relate to deadlines. Legal representatives, please don't forget that the 20th of June is the deadline for suggesting recommendations that you would want me to consider making. And this allows time to consider if further evidence, and if so, what is needed concerning those recommendations. I shall remind you again of the second deadline, but I make no apology for mentioning it now, and that's the 24th of October. Core participants may address the inquiry through their representative, if they have one, at the end of the hearings, which come later. 24th of October is the date by which anyone taking advantage of that opportunity must supply written detail of any closing arguments. We've called them submissions, which is a lawyer's phrase, so that anything that is said can be properly focused. Now, there's further detail in the statement of approach to submissions on the website. Finally, and looking to the more immediate future, I'd like to wish everyone here and everyone listening a refreshing break over Easter. Thank you.